So glad to have you rejoining us for a new episode of Curiosity, Not Judgment. Welcome. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
And we're back together again.
Yes,
Glad
in one
to,
room.
Yes, glad to be here together and just puzzling through some of the things that we encounter in life and joining you all in the conversation about how do we ask some of these curious questions to really help us in our relationships with one another and to live a more fulfilled, I don't know, I was trying to think of a second word to that, fulfilled and enjoyable life, I think, as we choose to let down our judgment guard.
Yeah, and just a reminder of why we even started doing this. I mean, I feel like if I think that I've got all the knowledge that needs to be had on any given subject, and I have judged it a certain way, where's the room for growth? And you know, I'm not speaking for everyone. People live their own lives, they're on their own journeys. But for me, if I'm not growing, I'm dying. If I'm not being out there and helping, make the world a better place and having useful, curious discussions, then the opposite is true. I'm making things worse. And so, toward that, we're trying to stay curious, not judgmental. And I know, at least for me, I won't speak for you. This also helps me do that. In other words, I was raised to be very judgmental. I was raised in a situation where I felt like I needed to be judgmental very quickly. I've mentioned before, I've moved 18 times by the time I went to college. My dad was a Navy pilot. And so I was in new schools a lot. And here's all my classmates. And I felt like they were judging me and I needed to do quick judgments just to survive, right? And so I was raised to be very judgmental. And there's nothing wrong with part of that as long as we've talked about, we stay curious. My initial judgment is probably not always accurate 100%. And I should be curious about the circumstances, the people around me, and how they change and how other people are growing.
You know, this is likely not the topic for right now, but maybe let's put a pin in this particular portion and revisit it for another episode, but really about how your upbringing impacts your level of judgment. I think that is something that I have really been contemplating, and the culture in which you spent your formative years, and what were some of the things that were dictating your choices, what were some of the things that were shaping your mindset, and has that encouraged or been a detriment to your ability to walk out a curious lifestyle? So
yeah, and that gets into nature and nurture and choice, and I guess what we're proposing or hypothesizing, postulating in this podcast is that despite your upbringing and your nature and your nurture and how judgmental you were raised, or whatever your environment you've been in, rewarded for being judgmental, that you can change and become more curious. And maybe that's not a good assumption.
Yeah,
we should be curious about that.
Yeah, let's revisit it. Well, we will. But for today, I think we really want to tackle this comparative notion and how quickly we can get into a world of stinking thinking when we begin to compare ourselves to others, whether in the well-being category or even in the negative category, because I think we can do both, right? Whose life is worse, who has more misery. I think we can definitely jump into the comparisons there. Or conversely, looking at who has more, who has better, who has newer, and be dissatisfied.
Yeah, and I've heard it said that to be happy is to be happy with what you have, not what you want. Because you're never going to be happy with what you want, because you're not ever going to get everything you want. And so I think there is some truth to that. I think that in my experience, it's never worked out well to compare myself to others. Even if it's to the positive, as you say, well, then I might get arrogant and might think that I'm better than others. That's not useful. But more, it's usually I'm comparing myself and coming up short and wondering why that person has more or does more or, this and that. And again, it rarely is good. And it's a form of self-judging. And it's a form of judging others. And you're doing that comparison is literally a judgment. This is where this person is. This is where I'm at. There's a gap, negative or positive, and again, not useful. So, how do we be more curious about that?
Well, so you had come across a question that really made you stop and think and really do some introspection. And I appreciated that. You and I talked about that a few days ago. And I really liked the list that you generated, but it was really prompted by that question. How often do you compare yourself to others
Mm-hmm.
and in which way? And as you sat and focused on that, you came up with a couple of key concepts where you feel like you really need to have these things to feel valued or appreciated. And I would love for you to go through that list.
So I'm a big in alliteration, as everybody who's been listening knows, and I have my 5 P's for this and my, 5 S's for that, and I came up with 5 I's, and I think I alliterate just because I don't sometimes think very well, and if I'm trying to come up with ideas, I find that doing the alliteration and always coming back to that, well, things come in 5s or 3s or 7s or whatever, helps prompt me to do more. So I at first had come up and said, how do I compare myself to others, and how often and why, and all that. I started thinking about influence. I like to have influence in any given situation. I like to be involved. I like to be involved in decision making. I like to be involved in groups. I feel bad when I'm not. When I was a kid, I had, Coke bottle glasses and severe asthma, and I wasn't even picked for teams. It wasn't even picked last. It was like, oh, there's an extra person. Why don't you go do something else? And so that hurts, right? When you're not involved in things, and I'm sure that's part of that's with me to this day. Those micro traumas. Interest. Are people interested in what I have to say? Impact. Am I having an impact on the world? And not so much anymore as I grow older, but in my early days, I remembered that income, which is kind of a scorecard, a scoreboard, used to really make a difference to me. I used to really think like, how does that person make more than I do? I am way more valuable at work than they are, which, by the way, is another thing that never ends well.
Yeah.
But I just thought about those 5 things, right? Influence, involvement, interest, impact, and income. These are the ways that I compare myself to others, if I'm being honest. And it's not good. It's not. It leads to self-judgment. It leads to guilt or shame or why aren't I enough? Those are all things that I struggle with, and I think that it was a list now that I've written down, and I look at and I say, you know what, I am worthwhile. I don't have to compare myself to others in these ways, and on the old statement of, I want to ride the thermals flat and flap less, and ride the thermals. Should I be worried about these things all the time, or should I just be happy with the level of involvement and impact that I have?
Yeah. I was really fascinated as we talked about this a few days ago. The way that we're wired is pretty different, you and I. We're different numbers on the Enneagram, we're different strengths on the Strength Finders. We have pretty different personalities, and yet I found everything on your list was applicable to me as well. And I thought that was curious. And I'm wondering if that's more universal than we might realize. But I think we've had this conversation before. I'll start from the bottom of your list, which was income, and you said has not been as much of a concern to you now. I wish I could say that that was the case for me, but I think all of these years later in my professional journey, when my income has not really gone up at all because I've been in the nonprofit space for so long, it does make me pause and say, man, am I not worth more than this? I've worked hard and I've developed my career. I have, earned my badges, and yet the income doesn't reflect that. And so as much as I try not to compare to others, I think there is that little part of me that still struggles in that arena. And, the rest of the I's on the list are definitely ones that resonated with me as well. And I think the very first one being influence and impact, those two I would almost say are hand in glove. 100% I want influence and impact. And I've really had to ask myself some questions over this last week of why. Why does that matter so much to me?
And I think this is the point of being curious, is the list is fine in and of itself, but What I need to do is now take each one of those and just do a little bit of writing about that. Some people call it journaling. A little bit of sitting with myself and thinking, why is influence important to me? I'm sure part of it is good, and part of it is probably not good,
Sure.
right? And each one of these, why is it important for me to be involved? Does it go back to the playground from when I was a kid, or is there legitimate concerns about being involved? Why do I want to have people to have an interest in what I say and do? Jim Collins used to say, try to be interested, not interesting, right? Why is it important for me to be interesting, for people to have an interest in what I say? Why is it important for me to have impact in the world? I think all of us want to leave a little bit of a legacy. We all want to, go through life having made some positive changes and impact on those people and things and situations around us. But how important is it? How much of a driver should it be in what I do?
And I don't know that anyone's going to ever come to a fixed answer. It's 8 out of 10, or it's
Sure.
one day a week,
And
whatever.
different seasons of our life.
Sure. But I think continuing to ask ourselves those curious questions about why do these things kind of ruffle me the way that they do, and to begin that introspective journey looking back. And maybe this does all tie together with your upbringing and some of the things that we're conditioned for in our youth, but it is a fascinating process to really think through the whys around something that is kind of a personal value statement, or something that you really desire in order to feel fulfilled or satisfied in your position. And I was going on a walk earlier today, and there's this older gentleman who has a dog that walks very slowly, and sometimes we run into him and chit chat a little bit. And I know he works at a nursing home. And I said, well, when are you eligible to retire? And he said, well, I really did retire. This is just to help make ends meet, because who can survive on retirement? And said something like that. And I said, well, do you like your job? He said, no. And so I mean, but it was so emphatic. I found myself just feeling sad for him. There was no it's okay, could be better. It was just an emphatic no. And I thought, wow, I wonder how many of these I's he's missing out of his workplace. And if he had influence or involvement, or people taking interest in him, or he made an impact, or he had higher income, would it change his perspective about his satisfaction in his role?
Gosh, I mean, I think the obvious answer to that is yes. And it makes me start thinking along the lines of, first of all, I feel bad that when I started thinking about that, I did it with reference to work. That's not everything that I am.
Sure.
I do care about these things in my family, but in my family, I have those things. And that's interesting. So I did go to work to answer this as a way to do it, which is interesting, and I should ask myself why. But then I started thinking, just now as you were saying that, if I'm a leader, or if I'm a supervisor or a manager in a workplace, or if I have any influence at all in that workplace, I should be thinking about other people and how I can help them have more influence, involvement, interest, impact, and income at work as motivators toward all of us doing a better job at fulfilling the mission and the goal at our work, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit or a government position. We should be thinking about how can we positively impact those things for others at work. And then you come back to family. My goodness, this may be universal. I can't imagine a parent who doesn't want their children to have some sort of self-worth. And I think a lot of this comes down to self-worth. For me, I'll use I statements. I feel more worthwhile if I do have influence and involvement.
Well, and even thinking about the leaving and cleaving phase of kids as they go into their teen years and into college and out on their own, and then ultimately into their own families, I think we lose some of these eye connections between our children. And I think that's part of the tug of a parent's heart and why it's so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the same level of impact on our children
Mm.
anymore because they are
Mm.
looking for answers from their peer group,
That's
or they're
right.
looking for answers from outside of the family. Were maybe not of interest to them anymore. Maybe there was a season where we could do no wrong, and now we can do no right. We are a generation that they don't understand. We don't understand them. They don't necessarily want to be involved in the same ways. We don't have the same level of influence. And so I do think this applies to family, but just coming at it from a different angle.
Oh, you just reminded me that I'm speaking of this in my family now, and I'm satisfied. But boy, when my kids were teenagers, I did have some very big concerns about this. What is my involvement with my kids? And now, maybe I've learned a few things. My grandkids now all my kids are grown. My grandkids who've now are either through their teen years or just entering in some cases, this is something that I subconsciously do and think about.
Absolutely.
It's a big deal. Thanks for bringing me back home there, because this is something that we should think about in our families and helping out those that we love, who are our family members, and help raise their thinking of themselves with respect to these.
So I see that this has application in a lot of different settings. Your workplace, of course, we've talked about family, yes. As we do any type of volunteer work or engage in the community in any way, we've talked about that as well in the past, and I think this definitely plays a role in that also. Just before I came over to your house, was in a community council meeting with 6 pretty strongly opinionated people that ranged from the lawyer to the community activist. And when there are things that need to be done in the community, things need to change, policy needs to be rewritten, something needs to happen, these eyes are still a very big part of the composition of a group and why someone would choose to be involved. And if you don't end up feeling that some of these are ticked off in the boxes for you, you will walk away. And we were having this conversation about this council that last meeting there was 50 some odd people, and there is going to be attrition as we identify a core focus that may not be of interest to some people in the group. That may not be the type of impact that they want to spend their time working towards. And so there's going to be, by default, people that self-elect out. And so those that we want to continue to participate, whatever the leadership team is, has to make sure that they are cultivating a culture where people have a voice, that they feel like they can speak and have influence, and that folks are involved, because you're not going to lose people any quicker when they feel like they don't have a role.
Yeah, and I just wrote down your input is essential. So if you have a voice that's very important, another I word, on this team, making the statement, your input is essential here. How can we ensure that you feel like you are involved, you're making an impact, you are influencing the group? Even if we don't all have complete consensus, which is very difficult, especially it seems like it's getting more difficult in this day and age. But how can we assure people that they are being heard, that they do have influence, even if we don't adopt everything you say as 100% the direction we're going?
Absolutely. And if we're asking that of ourselves in our involvement in our workplace, in our families, in any type of setting, how can I make sure that someone else feels that they have input or that they are being impactful in this group that I'm part of? What are some of those questions that we can ask, the curiosities that we can have around it, to set the stage for success as we engage with these people?
Boy, I am thinking about the last time I was in a community setting when I worked in the mayor's office. We were trying to put some electric buses in, if you remember. And if the people who were shouting the loudest, if I'm thinking right about this, probably felt like they were not having the right enough influence. And if I would have asked them, do you feel like you're not having influence in this process? Do you feel like your input is not important or is not heard? That probably would have gone a long way because it would have acknowledged that I've heard them. I've heard, and it may not be something I want to hear, but I've heard them. And that's a very curious thing in group dynamics, especially when people feel passionate.
For sure. And, to your point, you're never going to reach 100% consensus in any group unless it's you, yourself, and I, right? There's no other setting, just as people are wired so differently that you're ever going to have full consensus. But you can go a long way in making sure someone feels valued, they feel heard, they have a voice at the table, and that their ideas are being considered. And if you are ultimately the decision maker, including them maybe in some of the thought process behind how you arrived at the decision that you made.
Yeah, and I'm writing down more I words: inclusive, ideas, important, input. I think that, it's funny, there's a lot of I words here, and I'm also thinking of eyes as lenses and perspectives. But, practicing curiosity and realizing that these things might be have some universal importance to people could be a set of curious questions that you ask each of your team members in order to prevent turnover and to increase involvement in a really good outcome. Because if people aren't feeling like they have an impact and influence, they're not involved, and they start checking out, even if they're physically still there, you're not going to get as good of an outcome as if people feel like they're involved.
Absolutely. So let me go over those 5 primary I's again, just to kind of put it in fresh in front of you. Influence, involvement, interest, impact, and income. And by all means, we welcome your additional I's that you want to bring to the table. Gary's already thought of some new ones as we were just sitting here. But I think this is a great conversation to think through any kind of dynamics, family, work, community, other. Just how do those I's impact you, your engagement with others, and the way that you have the opportunity to draw others in and cause them to feel part of a team. There's no I in team, right? But definitely welcome your feedback. So please send something our way. CuriosityNotJudgement.com is the website. You are more than welcome to comment on YouTube. If you are listening on one of the podcast platforms, I'm going to direct you back to the website because I don't always see those comments. So CuriosityNotJudgement.com. Any wrap-up thoughts?
I'm just sitting here realizing that these things I probably make up my self-perceived identity. And so another I word. But anyway, think on that. We hope that you will ask some curious questions of yourself and others, and it will spur some good conversation and be helpful. In the meantime, take care.
Have a great week.